Hello, everyone. We do hope that today the technique will be better. I would like to welcome all of you to our Whale Shark Talk Part 2. Before we start with the official part, I would like to introduce the chat function this time really. So you should see under your video or next to your video a chat function. There you can ask questions if you have questions. And during our talk, so our plan today is we will have a talk from Jonathan, 10 to 15 minutes, about the part that we didn't cover last time, about the updates from last year's research expedition, and also a little bit what we're doing with the data, so what is happening with the data. That is the plan for today. Before we start, I would like to introduce us both because that didn't work last time when we were online. So I'm Jenny. I'm the founder of Galapagos Shark Diving. What is a dive company in the Galapagos Islands that is supporting science, like the research project, the Galapagos Whale Shark Project. So every diver who's diving with us learns on our trips what you can do to protect endangered animals. And at the same time, for each diver that is diving with us, we pay a donation towards the Galapagos Whale Shark Project. And that brings me to the topic of today, the research that Jonathan is doing. And I will give you the word directly. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for joining us again today. We did try to cover a lot last week, probably a little bit too much. There is a lot of information, obviously, and we had a huge number of questions coming in about the work, about the history, a little bit more about whale sharks and some of their ecology, specifically, whether or not they're endangered and so on. So today, what I wanted to do is talk a little more specifically about the data that we've managed to get over the last two seasons, but particularly the last year and last year's expedition, what we do with that data and how that data might be used to protect, preserve, conserve species such as whale sharks in very, very difficult circumstances. So what is it that we actually do with the science or the scientific data and how that then becomes a practical tool for conservation? So I'm going to go very quickly into a short presentation, as Jenny mentioned. So a number of you had asked what happened with one specific whale shark. We started the year last year with some unusual news. These are the tracks that we've been getting from the various different satellite tags. And this is the sort of data that we're looking at to understand how the whale sharks are moving, mostly in the region of the Eastern Pacific, what connectivity there might be in the region, and what are the hotspots? So in other words, what are the most important areas for whale sharks, where they might be feeding, where they might be birthing, and how we can better protect them in those specific areas. So we unfortunately started off with the news of one specific individual that was called Hope or Esperanza. We tagged this individual in 2019, in the 2019-20 season in August, and we were following her progress very, very keenly because she seemed to be, as you can see, a very wide roaming oceanic traveler, which is not unusual for whale sharks. We know that they literally do travel across the oceans. And you can see from this track here, that red line, she departs from the Galapagos archipelago, the Galapagos Islands here. So she was tagged up in the north of Galapagos, more or less here. Her first emergence, so when her tag first was above the surface of the water, which is when they transmit up to the Argos satellite platform, she was moving westwards, and she continued to travel westwards in the ensuing months. Pretty much in this area here, she was traveling along the equatorial front. So that's where the warm waters of the north meet the cooler waters of the south. And we know that whale sharks are temperature specific in their likings, in other words, where they like to spend a lot of their time. This is probably one for physiological reasons. It's nice to be in warm water. I think we can sympathize with that as divers, as many of you are. And later on, as that area shifted further south, in other words, the warm waters shifted south in the warm season, she then also moved down a little bit towards the south. And she appeared to be heading back towards the Galapagos Islands, which we obviously for us was exciting news. And that was when we called her Hope or Esperanza. She then did another about turn and went back westwards once again. And I mentioned last week when I was talking that we lost her track, and we think she might have fallen prey, unfortunately, to the industrial fishing vessels, which are obviously plying all of these waters. I'm not going to go too much into the detail there, but this is literally how the tracks tell us about their movements and about the challenges and the threats that they might be facing. And these, of course, are very, very real threats. So we started our year probably with a very, very sad piece of news. We lost the transmission, and we think we might have lost the whale shark. And we went into our new season to see how we could then gather more data and continue the work. This was just, I did mention last week the finding of the vessel caught in the Galapagos in 2017. And when the national park, the Galapagos National Park, inspected the holes, the freezer areas, they found a pretty horrific scene. And this was that there were somewhere in the region of 7,200 sharks, most of which had been finned, a lot of the bodies dismembered, including a young whale shark. So again, we know that the threats that these whale sharks are facing are very, very real, especially in the high seas areas. But that's literally just outside Galapagos. It's not too far away. So this is one of the tracks that we got in the season of 2020 to 2021. So our field season begins usually around about July, August, which is when we're heading out into the field, hopefully to do a number of different components of work. So we might be doing some satellite tagging, some photo identification, and we might be trying to draw blood from various different individuals to look at the blood chemistry for baseline health, to look at hormonal levels to better understand reproductive status and so on. The tracks themselves give us each year different information. So it's like pieces of a jigsaw. And little by little, we're building up a picture which shows us how these whale sharks are moving not only on a local basis, so in and around the Galapagos and the Galapagos Marine Reserve, but also regionally throughout the whole of the eastern tropical Pacific. And we hope at some point to gather data that will give us indicators of how they're moving at a global level as well. And that's one of the challenges which is facing us. This was perhaps the single most amazing and very exciting track that we did get last year, because this is the first time ever that a whale shark, there are other species that have been tracked in a similar manner, but a whale shark actually moved directly from Darwin Island in the north of the Galapagos and in the Galapagos Marine Reserve, moved up into the rift system and then along what we call the Galapagos Cocos Swimway, which follows a submarine mountain chain. And we know that whale sharks often use these bathymetric features, such as mountains, seamounts, fractures, and fissures, and so on, to travel across the oceans. How they use them exactly, we still haven't determined, but they're probably using some sort of magnetism, geomagnetism, and the magnetism of the Earth, the magnetic field of the Earth itself. But it was very exciting to see that this whale shark, who we named Coco, after the island of Cocos to which she traveled, actually went in almost in a straight line. This is as much as you can get straight line travel, perhaps, to Cocos Island and to the national park of Cocos, which belongs, of course, to Costa Rica. We know that this is a large migratory corridor along which many, many species, most of which are threatened, endangered, and some of them are critically endangered. For example, the scalloped hammerhead. We know that a lot of these sharks and rays and turtles and marine mammals are moving back and forth between these island ecosystems. And this is why we are pushing for the better protection of this area. And there is a very strong movement which has been proposed and accepted by both the governments of Costa Rica and Ecuador to create a protected marine corridor. So at that point, fishing would no longer be allowed in these areas between the Galapagos Islands and Isla Cocos. So this, in effect, would become a protected area. So all of those species that are, as I say, vulnerable, threatened, endangered, critically endangered, could then travel safely between protected areas. And that is one way that we can very, very positively change the prospects or the outlook of these species and the chances of their survival. So this for us is a very practical and evident way that the data from the project is being used along with other scientific data from other species that are being studied to demonstrate clearly which areas need protecting, why we should protect them, and how urgent this is. So that's probably one of the best cases and one of the most exciting tracks that we've been able to get. And you can see here the connectivity in the Eastern Pacific between the various different island ecosystems, Coiba, Malpelo, Cocos, Galapagos, and so on, which includes all of the countries of the region. And right now we have discussions between Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, as to how we can best protect the area on a regional basis. So no longer are we looking at a single nation creating a national park, but multiple nations getting together to protect much larger areas, not only because we need to look out for the conservation of the species, but for the nations themselves, there is a financial interest because it would protect their fisheries as well. And right now, these fisheries are not only being exploited by the nations of the region, they're of course being exploited by the far distant roaming fishing fleets, industrial fishing fleets, which are literally traveling from the other side of the globe. So perhaps the interest isn't directly in protecting just the species, but obviously economically it makes sense for all of the nations of the area to get together. And they're looking at data from projects such as the Galapagos Whale Shark Project to see how they can best protect these areas and along which paths most of these species are traveling. This was another tag that we put on last year in September of 2020, and it gave us a very exciting result. This one actually gave us a track which looks a little bit fish-like in its form, in its shape, and it was tagged in the Galapagos, you can see here, then went out, roamed around a little bit, zigzagged back and forth. We presume that they're probably feeding at this point, and certainly these areas are very rich in upwelling waters, very rich in nutrients, and as filter feeders, this would be important for the whale sharks. And this shark then traveled eastwards towards the continental area of northern South America and Central America, but then did a loop back and very exciting, came back not only to the Galapagos, but actually to Darwin Arch, the very dive site where she was tagged just over 80 days previously. So for us, this is the first time that we've managed to close the loop. This is what we had hoped that Esperanza, or hoped the whale shark, was going to do, to close a migratory loop that shows that they actually do return to these areas with high frequency. And this shows why it is that we need to protect a much larger area around the Galapagos Islands themselves. So you might know that the Galapagos Marine Reserve is a protected area which goes 40 miles from the baseline being the furthest most extension of every single island in the archipelago. So Darwin being the northernmost island, it extends 40 miles to the north, 40 miles to the west. Isabella Island and Fernandina Islands, 40 miles to the west. Isabella Island, 40 miles to the south, Floriana Island, etc., Hispaniola. So the Marine Reserve extends 40 miles out from the Galapagos archipelago. And what we hope is that in the future, and we're looking at this right now, how can we extend the Marine Reserve? Because evidence and data such as this tagged whale shark from last year shows that we need to be protecting much larger areas. Why do we need to do this? Not only because of whale sharks and other endangered species, but also to protect the economic situation of the fishermen of Ecuador and the surrounding nations, because these protected areas then become places where commercial species can reproduce safely, and the fish can reach then economic size. And of course, this is of benefit then to commercial fisheries as well. So this is not only protecting the species biologically in terms of conservation, it's also looking economically towards the future and how we can best manage and maintain the resources that the ocean has for the future of the nations of the region as well. So all of this information that we're gathering year after year, and as we adapt, change, and hopefully perfect our techniques, we're able to gather more information that gives us the tools that we need to manage the resources that we have in the region and to better preserve this species as an umbrella species, but all of the species that live in that particular protected area. So I hope that answers some of the questions that we got, and a little bit in a nutshell explains why it is that science in the oceans is so important. Because without that baseline data, we simply don't have an idea as to how we can best move forward to protect our oceans. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could simply say, yes, we'll put all the oceans of the planet under some form of protection, but right now that's not the reality that we're facing. So what we have to do to move forward, and this is a race against time, obviously, is to look at which are the key points, the key places, the hotspots around the planet and in the oceans that most need protecting urgently today, if we're allowed or to afford the species protection for tomorrow. So that's what we're doing with the project, and that's how the data is being used. So I hope that answers that question. And I know that we have a bunch of other questions as well. So
Thank you very much. Before we come to the questions, do you want to introduce the whale shark roar? I think a few people asked for it last time and they're waiting for it.
yes, okay. So this roar, and I actually gave it the name Dino Roar because you probably know whale sharks are dinosaurs. They've been roaming the earth for 70, maybe as long as 80 million years. So it's exciting that we're studying a living dinosaur today. That's another aspect of the work, which is very exciting. Few of the dinosaurs survived the last massive extinction, the asteroid strike on the planet, which extinguished a lot of the dinosaur species. So this is one of those species that possibly did survive that period. So that's why I termed it the Dino Roar. We were working with the Blue Planet team from the BBC, and they had asked if we could place cameras on the whale sharks. I talked a little bit about that last week. So we put the cameras on the dorsal fin of the whale sharks with a release mechanism, a small corrodable anode, which over a period of 8 to 12 hours would just corrode, and then the mechanism would release, and the camera would float to the surface, hopefully from whatever depth the whale shark was at. So we were trying to capture images, hopefully of behavior or maybe of interaction between different whale sharks. Now, when I was reviewing the footage, and we had somewhere in the region of, I think, 16, 18, maybe as much as 20 hours of footage, most of it with just a whale shark swimming. And in this case, the camera was slightly at one angle. So all you saw was the whale shark just swimming gently through the water and fish going by and so on. So not really looking or listening to what was going on. But I happened to have a small Bluetooth speaker next to me, and I put it up on because I was listening also out of curiosity to some of the sounds of the ocean. And then, of course, the ocean is a very noisy place. A healthy ocean is a noisy place. And to my amazement, I suddenly heard this roaring sound, which I can't really describe, but it still gives me goosebumps when I heard it. And I remember at that moment thinking, what on earth is this? It must be something mechanical. But when I listened to it again and again, I realized it didn't sound like anything mechanical that we had. Now, we know that sharks don't make noises. They don't have vocal cords, for example. They don't apparently have any ability to make noise, but there's still so much we don't know about a lot of the marine life. So is it possible that they have other mechanisms that can create vibrations or some form of audible noise that we can hear or other species can hear and is outside of the range, our audible range? So I immediately woke up some of the other team. This was quite late at night, about 11 o'clock at night. And usually in a research vessel, 11 o'clock at night, everybody's fast asleep. So I woke up a number of the members of the team and said, you must come and listen to this. And to our amazement, we sat there and nobody could come up with an idea of what it was. So we're going to play this for you. Just as a sort of also an added note, the BBC were very excited when we got this. And they said, this is great. We've got a first ever. And they were going to use it on the Blue Planet in one of the episodes. And at the last minute, we decided we cannot, until we have confirmation that this does come from a whale shark, we can't actually use it. So one of the plans that we have for this year is possibly to place some cameras again on whale sharks and see if we pick up any more audio. But at the last minute, we did actually take this out from the original footage of the Blue Planet. And even David Van Attenborough himself was very excited. And he did narrate a short piece where they were going to introduce the roar. So we're going to play the roar for you. Now, it's a very low roar. and we'll play it for you twice so you can pick it up. I won't talk whilst the video is playing, but if you want to turn your speakers or a Bluetooth speaker onto full volume, you'll hear the roar. You may be amongst the first humans to hear a roar of an animal that hadn't been heard on planet Earth since it arrived or since it began to roam the planet 70 million years ago. Okay, so I know it's not easy to hear, and I hope you're able to turn your speakers up, but we think that that might be in response to the shark. What you saw there was a silky shark appearing from the area close to the eye of a whale shark. And for any of you who dive with whale sharks or snorkel with whale sharks or work in the oceans, you know that you must not approach a lot of species from the front or from the area around the eye. That is when they're easily disturbed. So when we approach whale sharks, we tend to do it from the hind quarters, from the behind the dorsal fin, and we swim from the sides towards the front of the animal, but never face on. And we're wondering there if the silky shark, and what we think they're doing is ridding themselves of ectoparasites. So they swim down, they turn upside down, and then they rub across the top of the whale shark and the tentacles, the rough skin of the whale sharks, to rid themselves of ectoparasites. We think it might have been doing that, the silky shark, but got too close to the eye and could have provoked a reaction from the whale shark. All of this is hypothetical. We still don't have the proof that this is indeed a noise coming from a whale shark, but so far nobody's been able to identify the source of the noise itself. So we're going to be looking more into that hopefully this season.
Yeah, I will also put a link on the video when we finished, so you can play it afterwards again, and then maybe turn your speaker up a little bit more to hear it a little bit better, right? Okay, then I tried to be a little bit multitasking, to use the questions that we have from last week, but also the questions that came in. And I would start with two questions in one. We had one question, are there caves, from Joe, and are there any underwater volcanoes, from Marty?
Yeah, interesting questions. As far as we know, there aren't any extensive caves underneath Darwin Arch. There are some small caves where we sometimes find the odd shark sleeping, whitetips, for example. We find stingrays or turtles that take refuge, but those are very, very small. Where we do have a fairly extensive cave system is in the island of Wolf, which is about 23 nautical miles to the south of Darwin Island itself. We don't generally explore or go into those caves, as it can be quite dangerous and it takes specialized equipment to do so. But there are a number of swim-throughs that you can do if you go and dive in Wolf Island. Very, very beautiful as well. But in Darwin itself, there isn't an extensive cave system that we know about. Live volcanoes, yes, we have two possible live volcanoes right now underwater. One is in Roca Redonda, so just to the north of Isabella Island, south of Wolf and Darwin. There is a submarine pinnacle which rises out of about 3,500 meters or 10,000 feet of water, and this rises up as the top of a very large underwater volcano, and you can go there and you can see fumarole activity and bubbles coming up in the area. And if you put your hand into the sand, you can actually burn your fingers. It's that hot. So thermal springs that are bubbling up underwater. Also, we think that there's a new island appearing. So the Galapagos Islands originated volcanically from a mantle plume or a hot spot, if you like, in the mantle, where volcanic material or molten material comes up to the crust and then literally penetrates the crust, and you get submarine volcanoes. All of the Galapagos Islands were formed in that manner. The continental plate simply moves very, very slowly across that area, The plume itself, the volcanic point, remains in the same position, and new islands will then appear to the west as the plate moves over. To the west and to the south of Fernandina Island, which is the youngest island of the archipelago, we currently have probably what will be the next island to emerge. When exactly that's going to emerge, I don't know, but I've seen estimates of somewhere in the next 800,000 years. It might be as soon as 500,000 years. So don't hold your breath, but geologically speaking, of course, that's extremely young and very, very fast. So yes, we do have submarine volcanoes in the Galapagos.
Thank you very much. The next two questions would be, are whale shark endangered? I know you talked about that last time already, but I would like to mention that again, and maybe the status from Danielle. And how many whale sharks are there in the Galapagos, but also worldwide? Is there an approximate, and this question comes from Siegfried.
Okay, both very pertinent, interesting questions. Whale sharks were classified as threatened until 2016, when they were downgraded. In other words, the level of threat increased because of a number of threats: industrial fishing, boat strikes, bycatch, but also they're now being targeted by industrial fisheries. Their numbers apparently are decreasing. Their size and frequency of sightings are decreasing in many of the areas around the globe where they're being monitored, including the Galapagos Islands. So we don't have records going back far enough or detailed enough to know what the population status is in Galapagos, but in many areas around the world where they do have what we could term more resident animals, they appear to be decreasing quite drastically in some places. That would indicate that their population numbers are being affected, as I say, by anthropogenic activities such as fishing, boat strikes, and now, of course, a huge threat is plastic pollution. As filter feeders, they're ingesting a large amount of plastic, and that probably can kill them fairly easily, like it does with all filter feeders and many marine species. So they're facing a number of threats, and in 2016, they were classified as endangered. So yes, the whale shark is endangered. We don't know if its status is even worse. It could be highly endangered, in danger of extinction. We do not know. How many there are worldwide, we also don't know. It's very, very difficult to quantify these animals because you simply can't see them. It's not as if you go out to the Serengeti, for example, and you look at the elephant populations or the rhino populations that are traveling through those areas. You can do aerial surveys, you can use drones, you can use people on foot in vehicles, and it's far more easy to quantify and to count exactly what the population numbers are. When we're looking at the oceans, most of it is out of sight and out of access, so it's very difficult to have an idea. But we use certain techniques, such as fixed cameras down below. So that's something else that we do in Galapagos when we're diving. We take down small cameras, for example, GoPros, and we fix them at a particular point, and then we count the species that are going through there. So we're looking at specific species, such as sharks, such as some of the fish species, rays, turtles, marine mammals, and so on and so forth. So you can get an idea in an area, if you do that frequently enough, through the various different seasons and periods, whether population numbers are increasing or decreasing. But we do not know worldwide what the population numbers are. In the Galapagos, statistically, so extrapolating from the data that we've gathered over the last 10 years, so we now have a decade of data more or less, we extrapolate figures, and we think that there is somewhere between 1,200 to 1,500 individual female whale sharks, adult females, traveling through the Galapagos each year. It may be a lot higher, but that's probably a conservative figure. That, to give you an idea, put it into perspective, would make Galapagos probably the largest aggregation or seasonal aggregation of whale sharks on the planet for adult females, not for juveniles. So it makes Galapagos, once again, a very, very important area where a lot of whale sharks are literally zooming in for specific reasons, and those reasons are also what we're trying to discover.
Thank you very much. And you were talking about a little bit about the plastic and the influence of whale sharks. Do you plan to do work on that or studies on it?
Yes, we've been studying with colleagues. We're looking at plastics in the ocean, so we do filtration. So we're looking at plankton, which is in the oceans, and of course, when you're filtering for plankton, you pick up microplastics as well. There's an ongoing study which is going on with one of our partners, the Galapagos Conservation Trust, to look at microplastics in the Galapagos and, of course, in oceanic areas around the world. The results are pretty horrific. They show what we already pretty much knew, that microplastics and macroplastics are pretty much in every single oceanic area of the planet. This year, however, we want to look at nanoplastics. So going from a big plastic bag or a tarpaulin, macroplastics, down to microplastics, which is what happens when they break up. You get these small particles of plastics floating in the oceans, and those are the ones that are being ingested the whole time by a lot of marine species. And then, of course, inevitably by humans as well as we eat them. But this year we want to look at even tinier particles and look at nanoplastics and how they might be affecting wildlife physiologically. Not just wildlife, but humans, of course, because there's a food chain process throughout this. So nanoplastics could be affecting animals in many different ways. I saw a study recently which is looking at humans, because obviously there's more interest in doing scientific research and more funding for that, for things which affect human beings than there is for perhaps whale sharks or other species in the oceans. And they're looking at how the accumulation of nanoplastics may be building up in the optical nerve of the eye and causing early blindness in humans. So we are affecting even our own health, obviously, with plastic pollution, but we're affecting every other single species on the ocean. So one of the things that we will be doing this year is drawing blood with colleagues from the Georgia Aquarium, who will be joining us. We'll be looking at the blood and analyzing it for nanoplastics to see how that's affecting filter feeders in the oceans. A very, very serious issue indeed.
Thank you very much. Then we have from Diego and Becky. The question's a little bit more about whale sharks, so that we maybe discuss how many other shark species we see, how many other whale species we see in the Galapagos Islands, maybe about the size and how it relates to animals, why it's called whale shark, and maybe the size also in feet, if possible.
Yeah, most of the shark species in the Galapagos are being studied right now. We work with an amazing team of scientists who are studying the larger pelagic sharks, like the tiger shark, for example, which is more common than thought in the Galapagos Islands, but not frequently seen. We see them occasionally when we're diving. Very, very beautiful animal to see whilst you're diving. There are over 30 species of shark identified in the Galapagos Islands, the largest of which is the whale shark. So we often get the question, is it a whale or is it a shark? It's a shark, it's a fish. It's the biggest fish in the oceans. It is a cartilaginous fish, so along with the rays and the sharks, it's an elasmobranch classification. So whale really refers to its size because it's whale-like in size, and it is also a filter feeder. So those are the only similarities with whales, which of course are marine mammals. But that's where it gets its name from. Many of the sharks that we have in the Galapagos are resident. Some of them are partially resident, which means that they'll spend periods of time in the Galapagos Islands, and then they'll move offshore out of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, sometimes out obviously into international waters, and that is when they're most at risk from the international fishing fleets. And I see have a question on the chat about how the Chinese fishing fleets are affecting the Galapagos. Unfortunately, those long-distance fishing fleets are without any form of control, are taking every single species you can imagine, and of course having an effect on all of the world's oceans, not just on the Galapagos, but I'll return to that in just a moment. So we have species that travel outside of the marine reserve, which is why we need to protect larger areas so that the fishing fleets cannot come in even close to the islands themselves. A very exciting piece of news which has just emerged also from a study is that a tiger shark that was tagged over 7 years ago in the Galapagos Islands by Dr. Alex Hearn and the Migra team that are working with us with whale sharks was actually, and this is a small acoustic tag that was was used. So I think it was subcutaneous. So you do a small incision, you place the tag under the skin of the shark, and then they can travel around with these. And every time they pass one of the acoustic receivers, there'll be a ping of that receiver, and that way we know how the sharks are moving throughout the whole Eastern Pacific, as there's a huge array of these acoustic receivers around the Eastern Pacific. So we know that these animals are traveling big distances regionally. So can you imagine, for 7 years, this tiger shark was in the Galapagos, and then for some reason it decided it was going to head to Cocos Islands, and that was where it was actually detected in the last months in Cocos itself. So very, very exciting how this new data is showing us about the movements of all the different shark species that we have in the Galapagos. So some are resident, some are partially migratory and spend periods, like the Galapagos shark, the silky sharks, the hammerhead sharks, the tiger sharks, the whale sharks, some of the rays, for example, manta rays, mobula rays, and of course turtles, green sea turtles, leatherbacks and so on, might move between areas such as the Galapagos Islands and the Cocos. So we have a huge shark population in the Galapagos Islands, but many of these sharks move around the various different regions, and that's something else that we're looking at. And I think there was another aspect to the question which I might have missed.
Well, first I would like to maybe ask you the question, how long do whale sharks then stay? Because you said they're don't stay very long at the islands. You want to talk about that?
This is true, yes. What we see when we tag a whale shark, and from visual sightings as well, because we're using not only the tags themselves, but we also use photo identification. So as soon as we see a whale shark, we'll carry out various different components of the study. So there might be somebody who will go in and try and place a satellite tag on the animal. At the same time, somebody might be trying to draw blood. At the same time, someone else will be making a photo ID of the animal. So we do all of this as the whale shark swims by, and the whole procedure can take somewhere in the region of 30 to 45 seconds. So it's very, very rapid, and the whale shark frequently doesn't even know that it's been photographed and tagged and had blood drawn and so on. It just sort of swims along oblivious to what's going on around it. Whale sharks, and from the data that we have, only stay a very, very short period of time in the Galapagos. Generally, the average is about 72 hours. So it's a short stop. So again, this begs the question, what are they doing in Galapagos? Is Galapagos the final destination? Is Galapagos simply a place along the way that they're visiting? Does Galapagos play a specific role in the ecology and reproductive behavior of the whale sharks? Are they giving birth? Because these are mostly females, 99.8% females. They appear to have an extended abdomen, so they could be pregnant and they're giving birth to live pups. So are they birthing in Galapagos? If so, where are the pups? Are they down deep? Do they live in the Galapagos? Many, many questions, of course, that we're trying to answer. So we don't know exactly what role the Galapagos plays in the whale sharks. Certainly they spend periods of time feeding, and we have just recently, in the last couple of years, identified a secondary aggregation to the west and south of Fernandina and Isabella Islands. So what we now want to start doing in February and March, which is the opposite side of our current research season, is to go out and look at the secondary aggregations and see if we can tag some of them. See if the proportion of sex, male to female, is different. See if there are more juveniles. See if there are the same numbers of adults, and so on and so forth. So look at the population dynamics and determine what they're doing as well. It would appear that they are associated with high levels of chlorophyll. High levels of chlorophyll is associated with high levels of nutrients or food, and as filter feeders, there's a direct relation between chlorophyll and food. So it would appear that they're there for feeding. Whereas when we see them up in the northern parts of the archipelago, up in Darwin, for example, their mouths are closed shut, and it would not appear that they're up there for food, for feeding and for food reasons. So it could be that they're spending more periods of time in other areas of the Galapagos Marine Reserve and the Galapagos National Park and Galapagos area in general. It could be that these are different animals. They're not the same ones that we're seeing up in the north as the ones that are appearing in the west and the south. But obviously a lot more work is needed in order to be able to actually determine that. So it seems that they have a short stay in the Galapagos, and then they head off either westwards or up to Cocos or down to the Peru continental shelf break.
Yeah, I think the second part was just the maximum size in meters and feet.
Okay, that's a good question. Maximum size recorded, ever measured that we know of, is 18.3 meters, which is approximately 55 feet in length. The average size that we see in Galapagos is between 11 and 13 meters. We think because our measuring technique is more was more fine-tuned for juveniles. So we're going to be changing our measuring techniques in future seasons, but we think that they're between 11 and 13, maybe up to 15 meters in the Galapagos. So maximum size in the Galapagos may be 45 to 48 feet, average between about 35 feet to 45, 48 feet, giving you the both meters and feet.
Thank you. The next question is from Rick. Do you lead citizen science teams and trips? We, I think, answered a little bit of that last time already. First of all, I would like to define citizen science teams. Citizen science is the possibility for every diver to support conservation. That means when you are underwater as a diver, you have different programs you can support. Even if you didn't study biology, you can do it with a camera, with a GoPro, with even an app where you count sharks and mantas, etc. So there are many, many programs. And yes, we do lead citizen science trips. Some of them are led by Jonathan himself. Other are led by other team members of the Galapagos Whale Shark Project. And they're in the main season, as Jonathan already mentioned. So July, August, September are the main season where the possibilities of seeing whale sharks is the highest. And that is when we do the citizen science trips. So you can learn what you can do to support conservation of sharks and mantas directly on these trips. The next question is from Danielle, but also from Martin. How can we support our sharks and wildlife? Johnson, you want to take the?
Well, yeah, that's a very broad question, and one that is difficult to answer in a small period of time. But I do want to keep this as brief as possible. I think being shark ambassadors, in other words, ambassadors for the ocean, not just because we need to protect sharks, we need to protect all of the oceans and all of the species. But certain species are very key, and they're indicators as well. So sharks, unfortunately, are declining massively. Their populations throughout the oceans are declining. So those are one of the indicator species that show us what the general health of the oceans is at present. So I think sustainably perhaps buying seafood from sustainable fisheries. So if you do eat fish, which is a reality, a lot of people do eat fish around the world, it's unlikely to stop. We're not all going to go vegan overnight. That is not the solution either. There are no easy solutions to this, but certainly make sure that if you do eat seafood, make sure it comes from sustainable fisheries. And that's simple. You can look on the packaging. It should be available. If it isn't, then it probably is not from sustainable fisheries. If you eat something which is called oceanic sea bass or something, you may be eating shark. Find out what those species are. Find out where they're coming from. In the US, for example, I had somebody say to me, well, we don't eat shark in the US. Yes, you do. You eat it in large amounts. It's probably called whitefish or flake. And you might be eating it because it's packaged as false crab, for example, or seafood that is used in sushi and so on. So simply by making sure that you're eating seafood that is sustainably fished, that's a good step. Plastic. This is obviously, you might live in an area a long way from the oceans, but what happens to the what gets flushed down the storm drains in your city as it goes out into the rivers? The rivers end up in the oceans. So plastic that is in the streets goes down, cigarette butts, sweet wrappers, whatever. It ends up in the rivers end up in the oceans. So what you do with your plastics, just being a little more conscious and aware of how you live can make a difference. And I often get the question, well, what can I do as an individual? Because it's just me, it's just one of me. There are 7 billion individuals on planet Earth. The more that actually try to do something, the more of a difference we can make. So yes, as an individual, you can absolutely make a difference. Don't think because it's just one of you, you're not making a difference. We all make a difference to our planet. Also, be an ambassador, lobby authorities organizations to make sure that commercialization of products that come from endangered species are not available on the shelves of your local chemist or pharmacy. So if you go to Boots, the chemist in the UK, or Walgreens in the US, and there are products there for articulations for your joints, for example, joint pain, because you're an athlete, and you buy it because it's got glucosamine, and it might have supplements in there that come from squalene oil, for example, that comes from sharks or rays. So simple awareness, lobbying your authorities, making sure that government, Congress, the European Union, the British government, the US government has just passed a bill which would prevent the commercialization of shark fins. So all of these steps are absolutely necessary, because if you remove the market, then of course you remove the reason for the fisheries. If we can stop the market, if we can stop the commercialization of shark fins of all endangered species, whether it's rhino horn or tiger's claw or tooth, etc., then we can reduce or remove the reasons for hunting and fishing in an uncontrolled manner.
Thank you very much. And I would like to add that we only protect what we know. And so we do need the research you and your team are doing. So another possibility to support is, of course, to support research projects like the Galapagos Workshop Project with donations. So thank you very much. Let's come to another statement, I would call it. In order to help the oceans or to protect the oceans, a solution is to leave them alone.
Yeah, I get this question sometimes as well. Well-intentioned, I believe. Why is it we can't just leave the oceans alone? Well, in order to do so, we would have to remove one single thing from the planet, and that is the entire human race. So we would have to take all of humanity, all of the humans, and remove them magically from the planet Earth. Maybe nature will do that. If we continue to abuse nature, to misuse and pollute our planet, maybe nature will do that on its own. Maybe not this week or next week, but inevitably in the future, the human race will have no future if we continue to simply use our planet as a garbage patch or whatever. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the sort of all those details. Unfortunately, humanity is here for the moment. So what we've got to do is mitigate or manage our effects on the planet. And again, that comes back to what I was mentioning before. Each individual has a responsibility. We're not the owners of this planet. We're simply guests. Like every other species, we have a certain right to well-being, to life, to survival, etc. But that doesn't mean at the cost and the risk of all the rest of the planet as well. So as humans, we need to behave responsibly. Whilst there are humans on this planet, if we are to responsibly manage these resources, then we need to understand these resources. We need to understand the ecosystem. We need to understand the oceans, the atmosphere. So all of the sciences and the scientific work which is going on right now around the planet is oriented towards better understanding how all of these ecosystems work. How does our atmosphere work? What is happening with the carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere? What is happening with the pollutants that we're putting into the oceans, etc., etc.? What is happening with all of these species worldwide? And science gives us the answers to those questions. So science empowers us to better manage the resources that we have and mitigate or reduce the effect that humans have on the planet.
Thank you very much. What brings us to the next very big topic, fisheries. So we had a question from William, but also from Mark today. They asked, are there protocols that you can exercise when vessels come to unload all the fish, especially sharks, Asian vessels, Chinese vessels, but also about a little bit the Chinese money, Galapagos, everything what I think was big, obviously, in the news, what is happening in international waters, etc. Give us a little more insight in this wide topic.
Okay, yes, we're running a little short of time, and this is supposed to be a relatively short session, so I will answer that one very briefly. I would like to point out that it's very easy to point the finger, first of all, at the Chinese and at the Asian countries. They're not the only ones that are destroying the oceans. Unfortunately, a lot of nations around the world, including my own UK, a lot of European nations, United States, Norway, Russia have large krill fishing operations, etc., etc., etc. A lot of other nations are responsible for the destruction of the oceans right now. What is happening, however, a lot of the Asian vessels either use flags of convenience, but also they tend to carry out practices which are highly illegal, which are not as easy to control in countries like China itself. There are controls that exist in other countries. So yes, it is more controlled, whether we're talking about the huge Spanish fishing fleet, which lands hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sharks legally every single year, or whether it's in the US or whether it's in anywhere around the world, there are some controls that go on. But even the green nations, for example, and we did have some questions from one of our Costa Rican listeners asking, well, what's being done in Costa Rica, for example, because we know there are sharks being landed. Here in Ecuador, we have a huge problem right now with coastal fisheries, which are landing sharks legally every single day. So what we've got to change is the legislation. We've got to change the way that governments look at this. We've got to change the mindset. We need to bring in legislation to bring in tighter controls, and we need to stop the IUU, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries on the high seas, because that is completely without any control whatsoever. But again, this comes down to all of us. We need to lobby the authorities, our governments at home, because let's face it, if we have an issue at home, you can't turn around and point to a country on the other side of the world and say you're responsible. We're responsible as well. So let's start by regulating our own fisheries, and then we can look at others. But yes, it is a very, very urgent need right now, the regulation, the true regulation of fisheries, because in reality, only about 4% of the world's oceans is actually protected in real terms today.
You want to talk a little bit also about the international waters, because I think that is not always clear for everyone, international waters and what is, for example, with the Ecuadorian waters.
Yes, that again comes down to you have national waters, you have economic exclusive zones, which go out to perhaps 200 miles offshore, and then you have the high seas, international waters. And currently, although the nation can regulate its own coastal waters and exclusive economic zones, so up to about 200 nautical miles from the shoreline, you can regulate or control those waters. Everything outside there, which is 90% of the oceans, is not controlled by any authority. So although the United Nations, which is probably the only authority which might have some capacity to manage, control, or legislate, even they have very, very big issues when it comes to trying to actually create any kind of legislation that can be enforced on the high seas. So yes, we need to look at the issue of the high seas, but there is only one regulating authority right now, and that's the United Nations. So again, lobby your authorities, lobby the United Nations, make sure your government is talking to the United Nations and their representatives on the United Nations care about it.
Thank you very much. We have the last 5 minutes left. Would you like to add anything from your side?
I think we've covered most of the topics so far. I'd like to thank everyone that's really joined us today and the questions that are coming in. We could probably continue, but I think on a Sunday afternoon or a Sunday evening for many, it's a time to relax and so on. I hope you'll continue to follow us. I hope you will continue to support conservation, whether it's your local rivers, whether it's a local wildlife preserve, every single effort that is being made by any group, individual organization, authority, governmental or otherwise, needs your support. So I think that is absolutely key to helping our environment. We're facing a very, very uncertain future right now, and if there's any lesson that we should take away from a global pandemic, from something like COVID, this was Mother Nature. This was our planet not even giving us a yellow card to sort of bring it to a football sort of perspective. This wasn't a yellow card. This was the referee sort of blowing the whistle and saying, hey, I think you need to listen up and look at what you're doing. If we get a yellow card, it'll be a lot more serious than the COVID pandemic. And a red card will be the end of humanity. So I don't want to end on that particular note, but we need to take care of our planet for the future. As I say, we're simply the custodians of the future. We're guests on this planet, and we should be thinking about that future. And if our practices, on the ones that we are doing today, are not sustainable in 100 years, so in 2021, we should be saying, okay, in 2100, will these species still exist? And if the answer to that is probably not, then we're not doing the right thing today. And that's what we need to change.
Thank you very much. And yeah, for all the questions that we did not answer or I did not pick out, we will come to it in the chat. As I promised, I will put the link of the whale shark roar in it. If you want to have any other information, just give us the questions afterwards. I will try to answer as many as possible. And I thank you all for joining us today and wish you a beautiful Sunday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yep. Thanks very much. And I hope you now head out and go for a nice walk in the late afternoon, evening, and enjoy some of the natural areas close to home. Thanks a lot. And we'll
Thank
see you
you.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.